Thank you very much, Lamprini. Thank you very much to all the organizers, the British School at Athens, the Greek Politics Specialist Group, and the LSE Hellenic Observatory for providing financial support for this project. Today I will talk about culture works and affective polarization with a focus on vote choice. The abstract refers to political behavior more broadly, but we're zooming in on vote choice. And this is part of a larger project that we're running. The principal investigator for this project is Rulanesi from the University of Sari, who is also a resident expert on theoretical aspects relevant to the project. And she was kind enough to invite me to participate in this research, expanding my academic interest in new areas, just to keep things interesting. Joining us also is Iakovos Makropoulos, currently a lecturer at the University of Essex, as well as final year PhD candidate at the University of Strathclyde, which, as you will see later, is our statistical sergeant and visualizations expert. So we're talking about affective polarization. This is a relatively new concept to me, but one that we think is going to dominate academic discussions in the near term, perhaps in the same way that populism dominated discussions for a little while, and perhaps there is a little of a relationship between the two. So just to explain what affective polarization entails, this is the idea that the world has become highly polarized and it's emotions that drive that. We notice that there are high-level divisions between different groups mobilized around different grievances that they feel very passionate about. So affective polarization was developed in the US context, and initially it featured the distinction between Republicans and Democrats and how much they develop hostile identities towards each other. So this is the broad theory that it relates to is social identity theory in the group conflict, which highlights that groups tend to come together and form views, emotions of love towards the in-group and hate towards the out-group. So that means that the way it is observed, polarization tends to be negative. And I can show you a graph that captures that historical process in the United States, whereby polarization measured in this way, the extent to which people feel warm and sympathetic towards a party or a leader, or cold and unsympathetic, we can see that the positive feelings remain relatively static over time, but the negative feelings towards the other group, the out group, continue to increase, creating this big gap and polarized political establishment. The other main way that we measure affective polarization in the literature is by asking people how much they like or dislike parties and leaders. This second measurement, the like-dislike measurement, is the one that we employ in our paper. Affective polarization initially, I went the other way. Affective polarization was originally assessed in terms of partisanship. It's a negative emotional reaction to a partisan group, but might also involve various psychological concepts. Identities are not only driven by partisanship or ideology, but it might even have various other more complex internalized and psychological processes that relate to messages and frames that people are exposed to in a given political context. Now, in the austerity years during the economic crisis in the Eurozone, especially in the south of Europe, we found that there are romantic dimensions emerging, battles of good and evil, pro and anti-austerity camps in particular, which created a strong sense of identity and opposition with impact on political behavior. We want to go beyond that. We want to explore theoretically as a hypothesis whether a range of any other issues beyond ideology and also beyond austerity that was prevalent in the Eurozone might produce stable or not stable, but strong identities that can impact on political behavior. We conceptualize this loosely as the possibility of culture wars emerging around salient political issues and crises. And Greece has, of course, been at the epicenter of various crises, the economic one and the migration one in particular, with other issues picking up. So we don't know what drives affective polarization, especially outside the United States. We do have some indications that levels of polarization in Greece are quite high in a recent study. And we also know that there are political implications about this, with, for instance, one paper recently attributing the result of the Brexit referendum on affective elements among the population, and an even more recent paper finding out that it's a strong predictor for vote choice in Spain. Using the same data set that I will refer to later, we found as GPSG in a report that the polarization towards international leaders also has an impact on how much Greeks are willing to support European integration and membership. So we're aware that this is something important going on there that we know little about and we want to understand better. So the questions we're asking here is, how polarized is Greece really in a cross-national context? Let's try to understand where Greece fits in this bigger conversation. To what extent are culture wars, the way we think about them, I will explain, drive this polarization towards parties and the leaders? And what is the impact of all this polarization on vote choice? For this attempt, we use comparative cross-national data from the comparative study of electoral systems over 20 years. We have scattered measurements for different countries, so this is not a very consistent pattern of questions that have been asked all the time, but they give us a pretty good idea of where things are going and certain trends between countries. And we're also using a post-election representative survey conducted shortly after the July 2019 elections, which we will seek to explain. As a measurement, affective polarization is measured, we follow Wagner's approach, which measures the difference between the average absolute party like-dislike difference relative to each respondent's average party like-dislike score. I know this doesn't make very good sense right now. Just take it as it is. It's the established way of measuring affective polarization in the literature. And let's look now where Greece fits in this. Here is a graph with trends. Now, Greece first measurement is in 2010, and then in 2015, and then in 2019. And what we've seen there is that Greece, for the years that we have measurements, appears to have a leading polarizing effect in terms of emotions. We can look at the same exact results mapped in a map. We can see the intensity of polarization here in the direction. Greece, the red dot is the latest measurement. Greece has the highest value. Only Albania in 2005 had a higher recorded figure for affective polarization. So Greece is an excellent, actually, case study, as it turns out, to explore broader questions about polarization and perhaps seek to generalize given the intensity of polarization in the Greek context compared to others. So let's look at our own data after the 2019 election in Greece. Here we see that we've asked participants in the survey to indicate how much they like and dislike various leaders and parties competing in the election. And we can see that overall polarization, as in the US, is negative. Golden Dawn, for example, 0 is how much you dislike something, and 10 is how much you like a party or a leader. So universal hatred of Golden Dawn, for example, apart from those that voted. And we can see that overall, most parties and leaders receive a negative evaluation. Now, we want to personalize culture wars as part of the key theoretical contribution we want to make in this debate. So what could we think in terms of identities that are formed during crisis on a specific context, which might produce polarization? Ideology is the first one that we would want to consider, and we think of that as a form of identity. And we know that in Greece, there are some historical identities around these issues, especially given the against the right, with historical legacies of dictatorship and so on, continuing to be part of that conversation, impacting on certain aspects of the parts of the electorate. Austerity clearly emerged as a definitive main contest during the economic crisis, but again, that might have picked up a lot of the polarization, but it might have also diluted the ideological identities, given that we might not forget what the right means in Greece, but there's been coalition governments between a radical left party and a right-wing party, which might have diluted what all of these things mean or how much they polarize the electorate. In Greece, we also have a very significant focus on immigration in the context of the refugee crisis of 2015. But of course, this predates, since the 1990s, when Greece became an immigration country. This was an issue that was seen primarily as a threat, with some intermittent attempts to liberalize it and with Syriza in 2015 promoting more liberal discourses and policies in relation to the refugee crisis. Environmental issues might be considered a candidate for polarizing the electorates, with global attention on this issue, massive focus and understanding of how important this threat is for our future, and also in the domestic context, something that was likely polarized by wildfires, by domestic events, which we know from the literature has an impact on public attitudes. The proximity to environmental disasters, irrespective of whether they are man-made or natural, produces an effect on environmental attitudes. A fifth dimension is in the area of nationalism and has to do with the Prespes agreement, which the New Democracy, while in opposition, protested or reacted against to and mobilized participation in protest against it, but the government of Syriza went ahead with. And a final dimension, LGBT, is something that I'm not quite sure has been highly politicized in Greece, but it's part of a big conversation globally, and we wanted to see how that impacts on things. So we use proxies to measure these 6 dimensions. I won't go through details, just to know that in ideology we use self-placement, left-right self-placement as a proxy. For austerity and the Macedonian issue, we use identification with protesters associated with these grievances. For environment, we have, for LGBT and immigration, we have statements which indicate attitudes. I will highlight here just for the descriptive side of things that most people in Greece still associate with the anti-austerity camp. The median here, the mean is here 5.98 out of 10, and our pro-Prespa agreement 4.62 out of 10. 4.43 for the environment is notable to me because I didn't expect that we'd be so sensitized in Greece on environmental issues. So let's see how that impacts on elections. We have the 3 main parties that have governed Greece over the last decade. The Socialist PASOK was the government when the first memorandum was introduced, and then gradually suffered electorally, but and was replaced perhaps by Syriza and the radical left. We'll see how that plays out, with New Democracy currently the government representing the right, center-right pole. For our framework, we focus the key variables around affective polarization for both leaders and their parties. We operationalize the culture wars on the 6 dimensions that I introduced, and as further controls to understand really what drives vote choice, we include variables associated with economic voting, how well or bad the economy has gone and is going for self and the country, and balance politics, which is competency evaluations, which party do you think has the best leader, and so on. We run a regression for each of the 3 main parties, and a first set of results comes forward. These are standard regressions, and I would like to ask you to follow my voice and my cursor to make sense of this. So the first thing to highlight is that this red line here is a 0 point. Any variable that touches that line or crosses it is not statistically significant for each of these parties. The further away they are from that line, the bigger the effect. If it's on the right side, it means that it has a positive effect on for voting for that party. If it's on the left, it has a negative effect. The second thing to draw your attention is the R-square for these models. This is how much they explain. So for New Democracy, we are able to explain with this model 62% of the vote in the 2019 election and 59% for Syriza, a little less for Kinal, PASOK, which is we have less cases for. These are atypically high levels of in terms of the R-square. So we think that this tells a big part of the story of what happened in that election. Now, for our key variables here, affective polarization is by far the strongest predictor of around party, the strongest predictor of vote for all 3 parties, with a negative effect for New Democracy, a positive effect for Syriza, and a positive effect for Kinal PASOK. With regards to party leaders, when things polarize around party leaders, New Democracy benefits, Syriza loses, although this is just off being statistically significant, and that has no impact on Kinal. Let me show you marginal effects about these specific dimensions to highlight how big this effect is, especially for New Democracy. This here shows that if there is 0 polarization, affective polarization, then the propensity would be, or the likelihood would be, that people, up to 80% of people would vote for New Democracy. So under conditions of no polarization around the party, people vote for New Democracy and not for Syriza. That's an immediate distinction. The effect is a little bit less pronounced for Syriza, but you can see here that people that are polarizing around parties are far more likely to vote for Syriza, 30 to 40% more likely compared to other parties. When it comes to party leaders, the direction is slightly different. For New Democracy, people are far more likely to vote for New Democracy if they're polarizing around the leader rather than the party. That has an effect on center for Kinal. For our final part, we wanted to complicate things even more, and we are taking these same models and these same variables, and we mix them up employing structural equation modeling. That means that we are able to explore how our key variables, affective polarization, culture wars, and vote choice all interact with each other. This runs various models, and we are able to show you the results in a step-by-step part. So on the top part of the structural equation model, we are able to explore what drives affective polarization towards a party and towards a leader. An immediate observation is that these are not driven by the same things. People polarize around parties or leaders based on different criteria and different grievances. For parties, polarization is driven by immigration, environment, and austerity, not ideology. So this is what is statistically significant, and the bigger that number is, irrespective of its direction, if it's positive or negative, the bigger the effect on polarization. If it's dotted the line, it means it's not statistically significant. So immigration, pro-immigration, rather, and this is the direction, the more somebody is pro-immigration, they more polarize around parties. And that's quite understandable. If I'm pro-immigration, I might hate passionately parties of the right that are against it. Pro-environment is the only out of the 6 grievances, the 6 identities that we highlight that has an impact on both party and leader. And anti-austerity, the more anti-austerity people are the more likely they're to polarize around the party. For leaders, ideology plays a role. Ideology polarize around leaders, not parties. Interesting to note, perhaps when we'll come back to that to explain how that benefits New Democracy in particular. The environmental identities play a role here, and the anti-Prespa does have a small significant effect. LGBT, not weaponized, no effect on any levels of polarization in Greece. Now we take that, and this is part of the same model. This top part that I've just highlighted is part of the same model for each of the 3 parties. And I'll explain now, when you put things together, what sense we might be able to make. So for New Democracy, what we can see here is that the vote for New Democracy is more than anything driven by affective polarization. Polarization around the party has a negative effect. Polarization around the leader has an equivalent positive effect. Now, the negative polarization around the party, now that we know what drives party polarization, makes sense. We found earlier here that polarization around the party is driven by pro-environment, anti-austerity, and pro-immigration attitudes. And New Democracy, as a conservative right-wing party, center-right party, is associated with the exact opposite position. So it's quite understandable that it polarizes negatively. The other key thing here about New Democracy is that economic voting is a strong predictor of, with a significant effect on voting for New Democracy. People look at New Democracy as offering overall the best policies, balance, competence, and the most optimistic perspectives about the future of the national economy. So that's statistically significant. Anti-austerity, Prespa have a small but significant effect, whereas ideology, also right-wing ideology, has an effect. Now, one last thing about New Democracy, which relates to my immigration research, which is I focus much more on this. What we see here is that anti-immigration attitudes has no impact on voting for New Democracy. That's a little bit surprising, because normally, if you're anti-immigration, you're far more likely to vote for a center-right or a right-wing party. Now, if I'm interpreting this in the context of what we found about pro-immigration polarizing parties, it means that there is no electoral incentive for New Democracy anymore to promote restrictive immigration policies. To me, this is good news, because I would not, in my research, I make the point about desecuritizing migration, not seeing it as a threat. So the operational environment seems to have taken away the previous assumption that if you are tough on immigration, you get votes. That doesn't happen in New Democracy. And now, most recently, we have the Ukrainian refugee crisis. So the whole conversation around immigration is moving more towards liberal. So parties of the center right might consider how that affects their calculations. Perhaps it makes sense to not be too far on the anti-immigrant side. Syriza. Now, I'm going to start with what matters the most, which is affective polarization around the party. That has the biggest effect on voting for Syriza. Party polarization drives this and makes sense. Syriza was well positioned around these dimensions as a party that had an electoral coalition with ecologist Greeks that was pro-immigration and that was anti-austerity, the features that impact on polarization around the party. What is particularly interesting here is that economic voting has no impact on voting for Syriza. No reward or punishment for the incumbent in this case. But perhaps even more interesting, valence politics, competence evaluations don't have a significant statistical effect. They matter, but not at the confidence level that we're studying here. So it means that people are more likely to vote for Syriza based on emotional evaluations and rather than valence evaluations, competence evaluations. Finally, for Kinal PASOK, we start with valence. Here, valence didn't matter, competence evaluations didn't matter for Syriza and mattered positively for New Democracy. Now, for Kinal in 2019, they had a strong negative effect. Basically, the voters didn't think that Kinal is offering a clear policy agenda to deal with the issues that Greece was facing at the time. Currently, and also there is a negative effect from around the leader. And these are two issues that recently the party has sought to address. There is now a new leader, and I realize I heard in the last few weeks that they're talking about developing policies that can convince the people that they can resolve their real issues that affect their daily lives. There is a sign there that this might be an opportunity for Kinal, given that those that are optimistic about the future of the economy are more likely to vote Kinal, despite considering its policy proposals less convincing at that time. Positive affective polarization for this party, strong effect, significant effect. And again, if you look at these results in light of recent developments, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, Kinal went back to its old name, PASOK, which doesn't seem to polarize negatively against it, and adopted its old logo with a green sun. And these results seem to indicate that this might actually be beneficial for its electoral prospects. There is another thing here to note, the final thing, that anti-immigration, pro-immigration attitudes rather, predicted vote for support for Kinal PASOK. That's the only party that gains something out of immigration issues. So to conclude, we find that affective polarization is the biggest predictor in the 2019 Greek elections. It has a very important and underappreciated internationally effect on vote choice. And it doesn't involve only polarization around parties, but also around their leaders. And these two are independent dimensions. The drivers of what drives polarization around either of or are not the same. So we find that in terms of our culture wars, that it might not be ideological mainly or primarily that drives group dynamics, but any identities that develop around specific sociopolitical contexts which become weaponized and produce strong us versus them dynamics. And if we were to try to guess or to interpret what might be how stable this is, I wouldn't think that this is very stable at all. Whatever is most weaponized in recent political discourse and attracts attention, and whatever are the big issues of the time, not only internationally, as the LGBT issue indicates, but also domestically is likely to impact on attitudes. And finally, a final point to say about the broader issues of the direction of Greek politics, given that I hear there might be elections in September, that's some of the speculations about this. It appears that one of the issues that will determine the outcome might be how much people vote based on polarization around parties and leaders, which have different effects for the three main contenders, or based on valence politics, which is a separate dimension. Based on what we see here and based on the fact that different parties seem to be gaining the upper hand in different areas, New Democracy around conservative identities, but having to somehow negotiate progressive attitudes towards the environment, a tricky issue. Syriza around the key issues that mobilize polarization towards parties, austerity, immigration, and environment. And Kinal PASOK, whose appeal on economic voting issues perhaps indicates that it might reemerge as a bread and butter party and be able to attract some of support for that. So we may be moving away from the bipolarity of metapolitevsis that with the replacement of Syriza, of PASOK with Syriza in recent years, and we might be moving towards potentially multi-party systems competing and perhaps seeking to develop coalition governments depending on how the next election goes. So these are our results. These are a discussion. These are all preliminary and part of a bigger conversation. And we hope to get more data to continue this. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Georgios, for this very, very interesting presentation. Manos can now respond to your paper, and the attendants who want to ask a question can place the question in the Q&A space.
Thank you. I'm slightly embarrassed to admit that even though I only received the presentation a couple of hours before we started, I had the benefit of a long and friendly exchange on the telephone, which probably clarifies, improves my discussion in the sense that I don't have to say things that have already been clarified in the presentation. But on the other hand, it introduces an element of collusion to the webinar, which you might, it may be better if I admit that straight away at the outset. So obviously, I'm not an expert. I'm a mere economist. So what right do I have to comment on a political science paper? But as far as I understand, and this may not be very far, this paper looks to me really fascinating with lots of potential. Reading the paper, I thought of other ways of cutting the data, which offer lots of promise. So for instance, I would really like to know what the, I would like to see a cross tab of voting at the 2019 general election and attitudes to austerity, for instance. We know that New Democracy used to have a leader who portrayed himself as anti-austerity. I'm referring to Samaras, and the Samaras faction claims to still be quite powerful within New Democracy. So it would be nice, it wouldn't be conclusive evidence either way, but it would be nice to be able to show that, no, in fact, voters of New Democracy don't care about anti-austerity at all. I'm just speculating here, or perhaps it's wishful thinking on my part. This is not in the paper, but it could be, and I think it would be fun to know. So, as far as I can tell, research into the question of affective polarization, and especially empirical research, is still rather limited in Europe. Georgios mentioned a recent paper from Spain and perhaps some work on Brexit, but it's still early days, and I haven't seen any paper on the topic in Greece, although polarization itself, perhaps without the adjective affective, has been going on for quite a few years, since the early 1980s, actually, with the rise of PASOK, the Socialist Party. I think the paper makes a very good case for paying more attention to, and I will put it rather profanely, the visceral feelings of hating the other lot's guts. Is this a terrible way of putting it? As a key driver of electoral behavior. And also how policy controversies, the big issues of the day, and also beliefs about candidates' competence might help shape both affective polarization and electoral preferences at the end of the day. I will make 3 points, or perhaps 4, I think 3. The first is that it's a slight objection. I think that it's an objection to the temptation that by looking at the results, we may form a view as to the winning strategy of one or the other party. I think, properly speaking, the paper shows the views of those who voted for New Democracy or Syriza Original at the 2019 general election. In other words, it shows their identification or lack of identification with the party and the leader that they did choose at that election. On the other hand, elections, as we all know, are often won at the margin, and the trick is always how to win new votes without losing any old ones. But since floating voters, those who might be enticed to switch from one party to the other, are largely invisible to this this database, basically. I mean, it would be nice if we had a kind of panel database in which people answered not just the question what they voted in this election, but what they voted in the last 4 or 5 elections, and also how likely or unlikely they might be to vote something else in the future. So given that, and I would be impressed if any such data set existed. I think it doesn't. But since these data are not available, I think it's very difficult to, we cannot document the views of floating voters, and it's very difficult to make a case for the winning strategy, only indirectly with a bit of interpretation, and perhaps this is already quite a lot. My second point is that I'm a bit mystified, well, half persuaded and half mystified by one of the paper's key findings, that affective polarization works differently with respect to party than to leader. In fact, not just differently. The paper finds that the influence of party polarization, party-based polarization, is diametrically opposite, not diametrically, well, opposite to polarization around leader. And Georgios made the point that actually he showed that while the former, well, the kind of polarization around party favors Syriza, polarization around leader favors New Democracy. I think this is persuasive, and it's actually in line with many observers' perception about Mitsotakis being an asset for New Democracy because he appeals to, let's say, floating voters, while Tsipras is more of a liability for Syriza in the sense that he seems to send the floating voters straight to the other lot, right? Although he is very popular with a dwindling pool of Syriza voters. My objection, or half objection, is can we really disentangle the two dimensions? Are they really so uncorrelated? Is it feasible, moving to the implications for electoral strategy? Let's say that, let's assume that party strategists read your paper and base their next electoral campaign on your findings. Is it really feasible to engineer a party-based polarization, keeping quiet about the person of the leader, or the other way around? I think it would be quite difficult, although I can see the point, and I'm telling you, I half believe it, but only half. And the third point that I would like to make is that I found really interesting that immigration neither wins nor loses votes, according to your findings, to either New Democracy or Syriza. Again, I think that makes perfect sense. I have always thought, but that may be just me, that grandstanding on immigration seems to strengthen the loyalty of existing voters and perhaps strengthen affective polarization. You tend to hate the other lot even more as a result of their or your side's grandstanding on immigration, but it doesn't sway any floating voters, or not that much. And I think the fact that floating voters tend to be moderates whose views on migration tend to be rather nuanced lends extra credence to your finding, which is good. I have a caveat here, which is that these seem to have been true in 2019 when New Democracy effectively monopolized everything that lay on the right of center, right? New Democracy had no rivals on its right since Golden Dawn had the well-known troubles with the law and all the rest, and Greek solution was an unknown quantity, and not apparently not very not very successful, although it turned out to be successful enough to enter parliament. My point is that if New Democracy were to face a challenge from the right, perhaps the finding would no longer stand. Perhaps not. And if that's the case, if the risk of that is strong enough, and as far as I can tell, it must be, I mean, it would be, let's try to enter the head of the prime minister, who I suspect does not have very strong feelings about migration either way. I don't know, I may be wrong, but that's the impression that he gives to me. On the other hand, if he strays too much towards the center on migration, if he does a Justin Trudeau and say, oh, well, migrants are a blessing for Greece or whatever, then he would open up political space for a challenger on the right, and the whole thing might crumble down. So, I think it's salutary to show that migration doesn't really win any votes in the center, but on the other hand, it may, if you play it wrong, and I hate saying this because, well, anyway, my personal views don't matter, but it seems to me that there is a certain rationality in trying to pretend that you care about migration more than you really do. My fourth point, which I said I will only make three, is about the environment. The environment comes across your research as the quintessential motherhood and apple pie issue. Nobody wants to be seen to be against the environment, right? But I think the real test will come when we are confronted, and I think it's only a matter of time before we are really confronted with the trade-offs. Do we care for the environment enough to say, accept that the price of petrol will be even higher than it already is because of green taxes or whatever? I think that, I remember opinion surveys in which people were asked about their preferred age of retirement. If there is no trade-off, then perhaps people's preferred age of retirement is, I don't know, 25 or something. But if you confront respondents with the implications of their choice, you can have a low age of retirement and bankruptcy in a few years' time, or you can have a higher age of retirement and will be all right. I think it's rather similar here. We mustn't give too much. We mustn't believe too much the finding on the environment, because in most people's minds is something still remote that has we don't have to pay the price for. We don't have to put our money where our mouth is, if that's the right metaphor. I think I better stop here because I have started to mix my metaphors. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Manos, for those very pertinent comments. I think Georgios can now respond. So Georgios, would you like to?
Thank you very, very, very much, Mano. And one of the reasons why you got the presentation at the very last minute is because, as you suggested, there are a million different ways to cut this data. And we've tried about 999,000 of them, and before we concluded to this way, and we will follow your advice to run the crosstabs and demonstrate that and include that in the paper, because you said it's fun, and everything we're doing, it has to be fun, otherwise what's the point? So we're going to do that. You mentioned how these findings indicate something visceral about hate. I was reminded while you were talking about how in the Bible it says you're supposed to love your enemy. I don't know how exactly that would work. Seems to be a bit of a big ask, but I was also reminded of Kavafis saying that we need to be grateful to our enemies, to the barbarians, because there are some kind of a solution. But that's not how it works in politics. We hate our enemies. We hate them passionately, viscerally, and that seems to be a trend that is increasing in politics, and certainly in under conditions of high affective polarization. So you had a first objection about speculating. I agree. In the paper, we were not going to be talking about what might happen in the next election, which we don't know when is going to happen and what the driving issues will be. But I thought it would be fun for the presentation today to speculate and think about where things are going. So yes, for example, I'll just highlight that there are some things that our research in 2019, some things have radically changed. New issues have come in. For instance, the COVID pandemic has likely been extremely polarizing. We know it has been in other countries. The cost of living currently, the Ukraine crisis, all of this bring opportunities for these parties and certainly can produce polarizing effects among citizens. So new data would need to be collected to study more reliably what will happen in the next election. So what we can tell is that we have a pretty good, very strong model to explain what happened in 2019. On separating leaders from parties, there are, yeah, you're right to assume that maybe we would expect that these are the same thing, but the statistical analysis demonstrates that they're not. So it's not, there are some theoretical expectations of why that might be, but also there is an empirical observation that this is the case. We know that, for instance, that the right-wing parties mobilize around the leader very strongly. Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, I don't know, historical cases, there is a strong effect. Salvini, there is a strong effect of polarization around strong leaders in the right in general. And as to whether we can engineer it or not, yes, parties can engineer that. For instance, I'll give you an example. If you don't want to polarize around the real leader, you don't put the leader in forward in a debate. Erdogan, for instance, was not coming forward to announce restrictions in Turkey around COVID because he didn't want that kind of polarization. So there are strategies that the parties and their leaders can employ to try to steer the discussion towards parties or towards the leaders, to make it more leader-centric or broader conversation, which has different implications for each of these parties. On immigration, you are right. I forced that point because I want this to be true, that there are no electoral incentives for the right to be anti-immigration anymore. The results support that point, by the way. Immigration, well, PASOK benefits directly from immigration in 2019, but New Democracy does lose on its position because pro-immigration attitudes inform polarization around the party. And as a result, we know that this has a negative impact on the vote for New Democracy. You are right to also speculate that if New Democracy did what I would like them to do, to liberalize, it would be good possibility that another party to the right of New Democracy would rise up and compete for that and take that space. And that fits in with my idea, my vision that we're moving towards more multipolar politics in Greece, not the bipartisanship that existed in the metapolitefsis. Finally, on the environment, this is again an issue that has to do with the potential threat for New Democracy, is that the environment polarizes around both parties and leaders, an amazing and surprising finding to me. I didn't expect any of that at all. And now New Democracy has a problem because its leader is trying to present himself as being progressive, including in relation to environmental issues. He was recently in Glasgow talking in the COP 26. But its party, the party is conservative in these areas. And if the conversation goes on trade-offs, as you said, that will be electorally potentially costly for New Democracy. So we'll have to monitor the conversations and how salient issues are and how new issues rise and fall from the agenda and the dynamics, the group dynamics that these salient issues and crises produce before we can more reliably say how they impact on vote choice and levels of effective polarization. But thank you very much for all your comments. I agree with everything that you've said.
Thank you, Georgios. So we have quite a few questions, but I think we're running out of time. So I don't know whether you want me to read them, or do you think we can skip them and I can send you the questions maybe to take them into account, because it's already 8 o'clock. So I'm afraid that you will not have the time to respond unless you want to have a very quick round. I don't know.
We started a little late, so I'm going to try to respond to as many of those as I can. Shall I just go through the comments and give quick responses? I can see the Q&A questions.
Yes, maybe this is...
All right, so let me go through them. Richard, asking how
so the first is, can the data be broken down? Yes, they can, but you can...
Yes, we can do that. I'll just say one thing I didn't mention in the presentation, that in terms of the drivers of affective polarization in Greece, none of our control variables, age, place you live, education, gender, has an impact on levels of affective polarization, which is a little bit surprising, because when we did the report for the drivers of support towards the EU, we found clear intergenerational dynamics with there. So we have to say that more. One variable that did come marginally close to be as a predictor was religiosity. So yes, we can do all of these things, and Richard, and we include some discussion of that in the paper. A. Drakaki Smith, did you look at the issue of the way in which the media can polarize, and also social media, which can create polarized groups, also in the way in which the media can influence readers? Yes, we were looking at that separately. In fact, that's part of the next step of a broader agenda to explore how social media usage and also how AI impacts on affective polarization. This is a huge topic. This is a huge conversation. We don't look at it in this paper. We don't have good data for media consumption or social media consumption to make any claims about that. But there is no doubt that this has an impact on levels of affective polarization, and it's an important dimension. Thank you for raising it. Another point is the issues they come to regard the importance of this will yes, okay, so this is the same part of the same conversation. If an election takes place in 2022, what issues does the panel think most likely to polarize the electorate? Well, again, as I said in the conclusion, this we're not magicians, we cannot guess. We can only observe, and we have actually methodological tools to observe how salient the topic is. We can study and measure the discourse and emphasis that the different parties, different media, different actors place on different issues. And you're absolutely right to highlight that the rising cost of living, the energy security issues, the invasion of Ukraine, in addition to COVID-19 that I mentioned earlier, all of these are likely to be polarizing. It will also, we don't know what will happen in between. There might be fires, there might be anything, there might, all of these things. That's why it's going back to Manos' warning, we shouldn't really speculate about what's going to happen because this is a dynamic field, and it's this group identities that are produced around salient issues are not stable. Perhaps ideology is stable over time. Its effect might vary, but it's far more likely to be stable. But some of the other dimensions on whether they impact or not depend on the public conversation and how much they attract attention. Is the far right no longer to be taken into consideration? David, I hope so, but that's me being biased, so that's not a good way to answer your question. Well, we've discussed with Manos in response to his comments that there is room for another political force on the right of New Democracy that is perhaps more threatening to New Democracy from the right than the current offerings. So I don't know, but there is room for that. Will foreign policy issues now include ideas to Russia? Yeah. This is again a tricky issue, especially perhaps for New Democracy, because of, I mentioned religion there as a factor, so we don't know exactly what this is going to do to support for New Democracy and how it polarizes its traditional voters. Another comment by David, a comment the general public may need a definition of balance politics. So thanks for raising it. Balance politics is competence politics. It's who do you think offers the best policy agenda? And in our paper, the key variables that we include on that are which party do you think has the best leader, which party has the best economic policies, which party has the best immigration policies, and which party do you think has the best policies on the Macedonian issue. These dimensions is what forms balance politics in our analysis. We studied them separately in the first regression and together as a factor in the structural cohesion model. Did I answer them all? Is anything else?
You answered them, yeah. And then it's a question about foreign policy, whether it includes questions about Russia.
Yeah, I did mention very briefly that this is likely to have an impact, yes. A very polarizing issue, the recent invasion of Ukraine. We don't know what this will do for electoral politics, and I have not followed very closely what each party has said about it in Greece. So I don't know, but we expect that this will matter.
Okay, thank you very much, Georgios. Congratulations on the paper and good luck with the publication. It's a fascinating topic. Thank you, Manos, as well for your comments. And thank you all for attending this seminar.